As competition from fintech accelerates, how can traditional banks lead with smarter risk? Moody's research reveals how leading institutions in the Asia Pacific have started to embed risk management into growth strategies. With us now for more, live from Dubai, is Yasman Moghaddam, Senior Director, Head of Banking Practice Group at APAC and Middle East at Moody's. Good to see you and welcome to the program, Yasman.
Hi, good morning, Kathy. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, your research pieces drive us right into the intersection of risk, data, AI, and strategy in banking. So how are leading banks in the Asia Pacific carrying out that shift, where risk is seen as a gatekeeper to risk as a strategic partner?
So, Kathy, it's very exciting in banking at the moment with the pace of change, both in terms of obviously the evolving macro environment that you just talked about as part of your headlines, but also with the adoption of things like Gen AI and the impact that it has on risk and strategy. And you're absolutely right. I mean, traditional risk has been viewed as a gatekeeper or more like a policing function. But what we're seeing more and more in APAC is essentially more and more risk is being involved at the strategic partner. So not just as part of risk management decision making, but also as part of growth initiatives, with banks trying to essentially balance risk and reward. And this is essentially being done by bringing risk earlier to the table for things like product development, into structuring smarter deals, and also with a full view of risk and rewards into decision making around allocations of resources within banks, which is basically quite precious at the moment.
Yeah, really and essentially, opportunity there, Yasman, when you come to think of the amount of data available, but it's really fragmented. So how are banks overcoming that challenge of making sense of fragmented data to enable the early warning insights?
Yeah, so fragmented data, fragmented systems, data quality issues. This has been a challenge for banks and the whole industry now for a long time. If you think about data in the context of early warning, it really needs to do two things. It needs to be smart, it needs to be forward-looking, ideally cover an integrated view of risk. And I don't mean just financials and credit, but also it needs to be fast. So essentially institutions need to be able to get enough time to intervene before risk escalates. Now, in our research, if we basically look at a number of different ways that banks are working on this, and these are initiatives around improving accessibility to the data by various different stakeholders, looking at initiatives around reducing duplications, and also around improving the process and governance around it. But one of the most innovative ways that I would say that's been leveraging Gen AI by essentially looking at real-time data integration, to looking at that essentially merging live data from various sources, but also incorporating predictive capabilities leveraging Gen AI. So this is deploying AI-powered early warning systems to essentially make sure that we're identifying risks before they develop.
Right, an interesting time for traditional banks because they're getting a lot of competition from the fintechs out there. What examples might you have of the successful partnerships or innovations that are already deployed in this space?
Yeah, so you're right. Banks are under pressure. Obviously, fintechs are a little bit quick off the ground when it comes to approval timelines and so on. Now, in our research, we talk a lot about these innovations and even have some case studies of some of the success stories from practitioners and so on. But these innovations are geared to either improve efficiencies, enhance customer experience, get a more holistic, accurate view of risk. And also, we look at essentially some of these cases around how essentially these helped with the automations and so on. Now, the banks have managed to achieve these innovations. They essentially look at three things, right? And this is more efficiency around credit assessments. This is reducing lending turnaround timelines, but also improving consistency. And there are essentially a number of banks at the moment within APAC that are looking at those three things and actually integrating it and going live as we speak today.
Innovation typically moving ahead of regulations or regulatory guardrails, as we were talking about just a few moments ago. How is that evolving, the regulatory landscape, and how traditional banks are working with that while deploying advanced analytics, as you mentioned, Gen AI?
So you're right, regulatory scrutiny is definitely increasing around Gen AI and advanced analytics. I mean, non-compliance is never an option. So it's always important to have that view of regulation as we move forward. Now, we have to remember the evolving regulatory landscape is really not a new concept for banks. So this is something that banks have had to deal with now for many decades. They've been constantly evolving, innovating, complying with different sets of regulation. But what is important to remember is that it's always about balancing that innovation with oversight, because obviously those guardrails become very important as we move into uncharted territories. And that really starts with assessing how it impacts current practices like governance, like compliance, and then obviously how advanced analytics itself is being used for decision making, how verifiable it is, how explainable it is, but also, improving dimensions that maybe banks have not focused on so much so far, like, for example, cybersecurity practices and relevant dimensions like that.
Yeah, which brings us to trust and really bridging the gap between innovation, building that trust with customers and regulators around the use of AI and data analytics. So what are banks supposed to do to establish that trust?
Yeah, you're right. So trust is a critical barrier for sure. Also in the adoption of Gen AI, as well as we essentially discussed this with banks and regulators. But I mean, regulatory compliance remains a key focus, right? For banks who are adopting Gen AI, there's a lot of discussion around, accountability, around ethics, around data privacy, around transparency. And obviously in relation to wider adoption of Gen AI, but I mean, there's so many things to discuss. But if I was to summarize what really successful banks are doing in this space would be, establishing AI literacy teams, so having a cross-functional governance function around this, it becomes very important. And that brings that regulatory foresight into the picture. Data integrity and model transparency and explainability, that is, again, very important. And it's really geared and actually powered with high quality, well-audited data, which is basically very essential for innovation. And also collaboration. And collaboration is both with customers, so education, explaining the safeguards and things that has been put into place, but also collaboration with regulators as well. And what that does is basically build the trust and, creates that track record that becomes important over time.
And it all comes down to customer experience and really making the most of it. Thank you so much for your insights. Yasman Moghaddam of Moody's joining us live from Dubai.